On a Tuesday morning in September of 1992, Nora Reeves stood at the edge of a swamp in Crow Wing County, Minnesota, and felt the ground shift beneath her boots. Not literally. The ground where she stood was solid enough. It was everything else that was moving. 3 days earlier, her company's newest piece of equipment, a Caterpillar 385 excavator, $650,000 of hydraulic precision and computerized power, had broken through what the surveyors called solid ground. The machine had dropped without warning. One moment it was operational tracks gripping the earth, its arms swinging in a clean arc. The next, the thin crust of dried soil gave way, and 60 tons of yellow steel punched straight down into the black muck beneath, sinking like a stone dropped into still water. Now the excavator sat in the swamp like a wounded animal, buried past its cab, its tracks invisible beneath the surface. The mud around it was black and oily and perfectly still, as though the earth had swallowed the machine and sealed itself shut behind it. Every few hours, one of the crew would drive a measuring stake into the soft ground nearby, and every few hours the measurement would confirm what everyone already suspected. It was still sinking, slowly, steadily, with the patient indifference of something that had been waiting a very long time. Nora had not slept in 2 days. She was 45 years old, and she had spent the better part of a decade proving that she deserved to be exactly where she was standing. The daughter of Douglas Reeves, who had started Reeves Construction with a single backhoe and a second-hand pickup truck in 1961, who had built that into the largest private construction firm in eastern Minnesota through 30 years of early mornings and late nights and handshake deals and a reputation for finishing what he started no matter what. Douglas had died of a heart attack in 1984, and Nora had walked into his office at the age of 37 and sat down behind his desk and told the 14 men waiting in the hallway that there would be no disruption to any active contracts. That had been 8 years ago. 8 years of watching grown men look past her shoulder when they spoke, looking for someone else to confirm what she had just said. 8 years of contracts that required twice the follow-up of any her father had signed. 8 years of being introduced at industry events as Oris Douglas Reeves's daughter, with her own name arriving a careful half-second later like an afterthought. She had absorbed all of it. She had used all of it. She had grown Reeves Construction from 14 employees to 93, had taken on highway projects that her father never would have bid, had pushed into markets that the old guard said were too competitive for a regional firm. And now she stood at the edge of a swamp in Crow Wing County, watching her equipment sink while the clock ran, and the numbers ran, and the margin she had worked so hard to build ran right along with them. $20,000 a day in delay penalties. That was what the contract with the Minnesota Department of Transportation specified. Day 1, so day 2, now day 3. She did not need her accountant to run those numbers for her. She could do that math in her sleep. What she had not told anyone, not her project manager, not her foreman, not the 3 engineers standing 10 feet behind her with their clipboards and their carefully neutral expressions, was the rest of the math. The part that woke her up at 3 in the morning and sat on her chest until she couldn't breathe. The Caterpillar 385 was not simply a piece of equipment, it was collateral. 6 months earlier, when Nora had decided to bid on the Highway 10 expansion contract, she had known the numbers were tight, tighter than anything Reeves Construction had attempted before. The project required equipment she didn't own and a crew size that would strain her payroll. She had gone to First Midwest Bank in Brainerd and negotiated a credit facility against the company's assets using the new excavator purchased specifically for this project as part of the collateral package. The loan totaled at $2.1 million. The excavator was listed in the agreement by serial number, condition, and insured value. There was a clause in that agreement written in the careful language of bank attorneys that she had read 3 times and then told herself she would never need to think about again. The clause stated that in the event of material loss or damage to any collateral asset, the bank reserved the right to reassess the credit facility and demand partial repayment within 30 days. $650,000 sinking into a swamp was most people's definition of material loss. She had called the bank on the first day. The loan officer had been polite. He had used words like monitoring and assess, and we'll be in touch. She had translated those words without difficulty. She had 30 days, maybe fewer, before the conversation became something much harder than polite. Her father had built this company. Her father had trusted her to carry it forward. And she had made a bet, a calculated, defensible, reasonable bet. and the ground had opened up and swallowed it whole. She stood at the edge of the swamp and did not let any of this show on her face. She had tried everything. On the first day, she had brought in two Caterpillar D9 bulldozers from the company's equipment yard in Baxter. She had them chained to the stuck excavator and told the operators to pull. The bulldozers had dug in and strained, and the chains had gone rigid and hummed with tension, and one of them had snapped with a sound like a rifle shot, the broken end whipping through the air, close enough to the head of a crew member named Tolliver that he had dropped to the ground and stayed there for a long moment, not moving while everyone else froze. The excavator had not moved an inch. On the second day, she had called a recovery company out of St. Cloud that specialized in heavy equipment extraction. They arrived in a convoy of 3 trucks, set up a 50-ton winch anchored to a concrete foundation. They poured themselves 200 yards back from the swamp's edge and ran cable out to the stuck machine. The winch had screamed. The cable had stretched in a way that cable was not meant to stretch. And then the anchor, the freshly poured concrete anchor that was supposed to be immovable, had torn itself out of the earth in a single violent lurch, and the recovery crew's senior operator had looked at Nora and said quietly and without apology that there was nothing more his equipment could do here. The excavator had sunk another 6 inches overnight. On the third day, she had arranged for a crane company out of Brainerd, a large-capacity unit, a 110-ton lift, rating the kind of machine that could move anything on a normal job site. The operator had driven his rig to the edge of the construction site, stepped out, walked to the rim of the swamp, and stood there for a long time looking at the ground. Then he had turned around and walked back to his truck without saying a word. His foreman had delivered the message. The ground won't hold us. You want 2 machines in that swamp instead of 1. Now it was the morning of day 3, and the engineers behind her were talking in low voices about options that were not really options. A helicopter sky crane out of Minneapolis, an Air National Guard unit that did heavy lifts. $15,000 an hour, Nora said without turning around. And by the time it mobilizes and gets here, we're looking at tomorrow at the earliest. The excavator will be another foot deeper. What else? Draining the swamp. The youngest engineer, whose name was Caldwell, and who had been on the job for 11 months, offered this with the careful optimism of someone who knows it won't work, but wants to appear to be contributing. Nora turned and looked at him. He had the good grace to finish his own thought. That swamp is fed by an underground spring. Draining it would take weeks we don't have, and he stopped. Money we don't have, Nora finished for him. She said it quietly without anger. It was just a fact. She turned back to the swamp. The mud around the excavator was absolutely still. The machine was up to its windows now. A few days more and it would be gone entirely. It was at that moment that she heard the sound of a tractor. Not the industrial growl of a piece of construction equipment. Something older, more mechanical, the unhurried chug of a farm tractor driven by someone in no particular hurry. She turned and saw a John Deere old enough that it had the narrower frame of a machine built in the 1960s pulling along the edge of the construction site's access road. It stopped near the site perimeter. A man climbed down from it. He was old. That was the first thing she registered. Old in the way of men who have spent their entire lives outdoors, where the sun and wind do their work over decades carving lines into a face the way water carves stone. He wore denim overalls over a chambray shirt. His boots were mud-caked. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone who had stopped being in a hurry sometime in his 50s and had not seen any reason to resume. He was, Nora estimated, somewhere in his 70s. He crossed the site toward her without asking permission, and something in the way he moved unhurried but direct, as though he had done this particular walk already in his mind and was simply following the path, kept her from stopping him. She watched him approach. He stopped at a reasonable distance and looked at the stuck excavator for a long moment. Then he looked at the bulldozers sitting uselessly at the edge of the swamp, then at the snapped length of chain lying in the mud where it had been since the first day. Then he looked at Nora. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "My name is Earl McCready. I farm the land on the other side of that tree line." He nodded toward the dense stand of birch and ash that bordered the swamp to the northeast. 400 acres, same family for 60 years. He paused. "I saw your problem. Thought I might be able to help." One of the engineers behind her made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when they are trying to decide whether something is funny or not. Nora looked at Earl McCready. She looked at the worn overalls, the mud-caked boots, the face that belonged to a man who had been watching weather come across a flat Minnesota landscape for half a century. She looked at the John Deere parked on the access road. "Mr. McCready," she said carefully, "we've had two D9 bulldozers and a 50-ton winch fail on this machine. I appreciate you coming over, but—" "Not with the John Deere," Earl said. He said it the way you say something that should be obvious. Nora stopped. "With my steam traction engine," Earl said. "Case 1912 model, 110 horsepower. She's been in my family since new, 80 years this spring." The engineer named Caldwell did laugh this time. He tried to turn it into a cough. He did not entirely succeed. Nora did not laugh. She was too tired to laugh, and she was watching Earl McCready's face, and his face was doing nothing that suggested he was anything other than completely serious. "A steam engine from 1912, she said slowly. "That's right. My bulldozers produce more horsepower than your entire farm. They couldn't move that excavator. What would a steam tractor from 80 years ago do differently?" Earl looked at the stuck excavator. He looked at the D9 bulldozers. He looked at the snapped chain. He seemed to be arranging his thoughts not for his own benefit, but for hers, the way a person does when they are about to explain something that matters. "Your machines make horsepower," he said. "Mine makes torque. There's a difference. Enlighten me." "Horsepower is how fast you can do work. Torque is how much work you can do. Your bulldozers were built to push dirt on solid level ground. They're fast and they're efficient, and on a normal job site, they'll outwork anything I've got. But they were not designed for this. They spin. When the load exceeds their grip, the tracks slip and the power goes nowhere." He glanced at the ruts the bulldozers had torn into the soft ground near the swamp's edge. You can see where they spun out. Nora had seen exactly that. She had watched it happen on day one. She had simply not had a better explanation for it. "My steamer was built to pull threshing machines through muddy fields in Iowa and Minnesota all day, for weeks at a stretch," Earl continued. 6-foot drive wheels, steel cleats 2 inches deep, 22 tons of machine sitting on top of those cleats giving them grip. She doesn't spin. When she pulls, she pulls. And she doesn't have any of the systems. Your modern equipment has the sensors, the computers, the load limiters that tell the machine it's working too hard and cut power to protect it. "What do you mean your equipment is designed to protect itself?" Earl said. "When it senses an overload, it backs off. That's good engineering. It prevents damage, saves money, extends machine life. But it also means there's a ceiling on what those machines will do. They work up to a point, and then they stop, because stopping is what they're programmed to do. They won't destroy themselves trying to finish a job." He let that sit for a moment. "My steamer doesn't know any better," he said. "It just pulls. The only thing telling it when to stop is me." Nora looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the excavator, then back at him. "Why are you here, Mr. McCready?" Earl seemed to consider the question as though it was more genuinely interesting than most questions people asked him. "I watched you struggle for 3 days," he said. "I watched your people try everything they had. I knew what you needed, and I waited to see if you'd figure it out, because if you could figure it out, you wouldn't need me." He looked at the swamp. "You didn't figure it out. So here I am. What do you want for this?" Earl shook his head. "Not charging anything. If it doesn't work, you've lost an hour and nothing more. If it works, I'd ask for a donation to the Crow Wing Historical Society. They helped me restore that engine back in the 80s. They could use the money more than I could." Behind Nora there was a silence. Not the silence of men being polite. The silence of men who have run out of objections. She looked at the excavator one more time. The mud was at the lower edge of the windshield now. "Fine," she said. "Bring your machine." What she said after that quietly before she turned back to the swamp, she would think about later. She said it half to Earl and half to herself. "But be quick." Earl nodded once and walked back to his John Deere without any sign of being rushed. Now here's what you need to understand about Earl McCready, because understanding the man is the only way to understand what he was about to do. Earl was 73 years old and had been farming the same 400 acres in Crow Wing County since he was 23, when his father had signed the property over to him and moved to Duluth to live out his retirement near the lake. 50 years on the same land, 50 planting seasons, 50 harvests, 50 winters watching the snow come across the flat Minnesota fields, and 50 springs watching it go. He had not become wealthy from this land. He had not become famous. He had not built anything that would appear in a business journal or earn a mention at a county chamber of commerce dinner. He had simply worked year after year with the patient attention of a man who understood that land does not respond to urgency. It responds to knowledge and consistency and the willingness to be there when it needs you, not just when it's convenient. He had learned almost everything he knew from his grandfather, Silas McCready. Silas had been born in 1880 on a farm in central Wisconsin and had moved to Minnesota as a young man following the cheap land that was available to anyone willing to break new ground in the early years of the century. In 1912, Silas had made the largest single purchase of his life, a Case steam traction engine direct from the manufacturer in Racine, Wisconsin. 110 horsepower, 22 tons, 6-foot rear drive wheels studded with steel cleats, a boiler that could hold 150 gallons of water and generate enough pressure, Silas used to say, to move anything that needed moving. The machine had cost $3,200. In 1912, that was more than most farms in the county were worth. Silas had used it for 20 years, pulling threshing machines from farm to farm during the harvest seasons when the crews moved across the countryside in a long convoy, doing in a week what would otherwise take a month, dragging stumps from fields being cleared for planting, moving loads that horses could not move and early gasoline tractors could not dream of moving. The steam engine was the heavy lift machine of its era, the piece of equipment you called when everything else had reached its limit. When gasoline tractors became common in the late 20s and early 30s, most farmers sold or scrapped their steamers. The machines were expensive to operate, slow to start, required constant attention, and the new gasoline equipment was faster and easier and good enough for most of what needed doing. It was progress, and progress moved on, and the steam engines went to the scrap yards. Silas could not bring himself to do it. He had parked the engine in the large shed behind the barn, covered it with 2 layers of heavy canvas, and told himself he might need it again someday. He never did. Silas died in 1951, and the machine sat in the shed for another 33 years through the ownership of Earl's father and into Earl's own tenure, untouched, unstarted, but intact. Earl had found it in 1984 when he was clearing the old shed to make room for a combine he'd bought the previous autumn. He'd moved aside old equipment and broken furniture and boxes of tools and feed sacks that had been there so long they'd fused to the floor. And then he'd pulled back the canvas and found the engine exactly as Silas had left it in the early 1930s. Rusty, yes. Dusty, certainly. But complete. Every part still present. The boiler had held pressure when Earl tested it carefully with a hand pump. The gears had turned when he worked them by hand. The cleats on the drive wheels were worn but solid. It was a machine that had been asleep for 50 years, and it had been waiting. Earl had spent 3 years restoring it. He had found a retired machinist in the county who remembered working on steamers in his young days and who spent long afternoons in Earl's shed with a coffee thermos and a set of files explaining what he was looking at. Earl had tracked down original parts from collectors and museums across the upper Midwest. He had learned to operate the machine from a combination of factory manuals printed in 1912 and old men at county fairs who could still remember the age of steam and were always willing to talk to someone who genuinely wanted to learn. By 1987, the case was running again. Earl took it to county fairs and steam shows. He demonstrated it for school groups who had never seen anything like it and stood with their mouths open when the whistle cut loose. He kept the machine in perfect working condition, fired up the boiler once a month to keep everything moving to make sure every valve and fitting and gear was ready. He did this not because he expected to need it, but because it seemed like the right way to treat something that had been built with such care by people who were long gone. He had always known the engine was powerful, in the way that you know something from a lifetime of paying attention without needing to demonstrate it to anyone. He had simply never had the right occasion. Now, walking back across the construction site to his John Deere, he thought about his grandfather standing at the controls of this same machine in the autumn of 1914, pulling a neighbor's thresher out of a ditch that had been made impassable by 3 days of rain. He thought about Silas covering the engine with canvas for the last time, still believing it might be needed again. He thought about the 33 years it had sat in the dark waiting. He climbed back onto the John Deere and drove home without hurrying. The machine would take 2 hours to bring to operating temperature. There was no shortcut for that. Steam under pressure was something you either respected completely or not at all. Silas had taught him that when he was 9 years old, sitting on the platform of the running engine with his legs hanging over the edge, watching his grandfather's hands move across the gauges. You never rush the steam, Silas had said. You let it build in its own time. It'll tell you when it's ready. Earl had never forgotten that. Back on the construction site, Nora stood at the edge of the swamp and listened to the sound of the John Deere fade down the access road. Behind her, she could hear the engineers talking. The word antique appeared more than once. The word museum. One of them, not Caldwell. One of the older ones said something about liability and what would happen if the old man's equipment failed and caused additional damage to the excavator. Nora did not turn around. She was thinking about numbers, about 30 days, about the clause in the bank agreement and the loan officer's careful voice on the phone, about the fact that she had run through every option she had and they had all failed, and the best remaining choice available to her was to wait for a 73-year-old farmer to fire up a steam engine that had been built the same year the Titanic sailed. She thought about her father, about the way Douglas Reeves had made decisions, which was to look at what was in front of him without flinching and then do what the situation required regardless of whether it was what he had planned. She had seen him once, during the bad winter of 1978, redirect an entire crew at 2 in the morning because the ground had frozen harder than the forecast predicted and the original plan was no longer viable. He had not complained about the forecast being wrong. He had simply looked at the ground and made a new plan. You work with what's in front of you, he had told her afterward, not what you expected to be in front of you. What's actually there? She looked at the swamp. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and dialed home. It rang 3 times. The woman who watched Bridget on long work days answered, told her everything was fine, held the phone so Bridget could say something into it. Nora could hear her daughter's voice, 5 years old, high and quick and full of something that had just happened and needed to be reported immediately. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She pressed the phone closer to her ear and listened to her daughter talk until the words stopped. She said goodnight. She put the phone back in her jacket and then stood alone at the edge of the swamp, looking at the place where a machine worth everything was disappearing into the earth, and waited for the sound of something old coming back to life. The sound came before the machine did. That was the thing nobody on the construction site expected. They had been watching the access road waiting to see something, and instead they heard something first. A deep rhythmic pulse, low and steady, like the heartbeat of an animal, larger than anything that had a right to be walking around in Crow Wing County on a Tuesday morning in September. It came from somewhere down the county road, muffled at first by distance and the stand of birch and ash that bordered the site to the northeast, and then gradually less muffled, gradually more present until the ground itself began to carry it. A faint vibration you could feel through the soles of your boots if you were standing still and paying attention. Garrett Pruitt was not paying attention. He was sitting on the running board of one of the idle D9 bulldozers, eating a sandwich. He had lost interest in staring at the stuck excavator with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to change for 3 days and has stopped believing it will. He was 28 years old and had worked for Reeves Construction for 4 years, and he was good at his job, which was operating heavy equipment on ground that was solid and level and behaved the way ground was supposed to behave. He was not good at waiting. He was not good at the particular feeling he had carried for the past 3 days, which was the feeling of being useless in a situation that required someone to be useful. He had laughed when the old man appeared that morning. Not loudly and not cruelly, but he had laughed because the alternative was to keep sitting with the feeling, and the old man's arrival had offered something easier than that. A man with a steam tractor from 80 years ago. A museum piece. Garrett had said something to the man next to him, something he would not be able to remember clearly later. Something that got a small laugh from a few of the crew standing nearby. Now he felt the vibration through the running board and put down the sandwich and looked up. The construction crew heard the sound build for nearly 4 minutes before they saw anything. There was time for men to stop what they were doing, for conversations to trail off, for everyone on the site to orient themselves toward the access road with the instinctive attention that unusual sounds produce in people who work outdoors and have learned to notice what the environment is telling them. By the time the steam engine crested the small rise where the county road met the access road, Every person on that site was looking at it. The machine came over the rise at 5 miles an hour, which was close to its top speed, and for a moment it simply occupied the skyline. Earl McCready sat at the controls on the elevated platform at the rear of the engine, one hand on the throttle, his posture the relaxed and upright posture of a man who has operated this particular machine enough times that it no longer requires conscious attention. Black smoke rose from the vertical stack. Steam escaped in small jets from the pressure relief valves, white against the gray September sky. The boiler was painted black and gleaming, the brass fittings polished to a brightness that caught the morning light. And the wheels. The rear drive wheels were 6 feet in diameter, steel-rimmed each cleat, a solid raised bar of forged steel 2 inches high and 8 inches wide, and as the engine came down the slope toward the site, those cleats bit into the gravel of the access road with a sound and a deliberateness that was entirely unlike the sound of rubber tires or steel tracks on soft ground. Each rotation was a statement. Each cleat finding the road and gripping it and releasing it was a small, separate event, and there were enough of them coming fast enough that the cumulative effect was something between a sound and a sensation, something you received through your feet and your chest rather than just your ears. The youngest engineer, Caldwell, said nothing. His clipboard was at his side. His mouth was open. The senior engineer, a man named Burkhart, who had been building roads in Minnesota for 22 years, stood with his arms crossed and watched the steam engine descend toward the site and did not say a word. Later, he would tell his wife that it was the most impressive thing he had seen on a job site in 2 decades. He did not say this in a tone of happiness. He said it in the tone of a man who was recalibrating something fundamental. Nora watched from the edge of the swamp. She had watched Earl leave 2 hours earlier with the certainty of someone who had already made his decision and had nothing left to resolve. She had spent those 2 hours on the phone with the bank, with her insurance carrier, with her project manager, and Baxter, with the MNDOT liaison, who was beginning to ask pointed questions about the timeline. She had made all of those calls with the excavator behind her, and the smell of the swamp in the air, and the complete knowledge that none of those calls was going to change what was actually happening, which was that a machine she needed was disappearing into the earth, and she was waiting for an old man and an older machine to do what everything else had failed to do. She did not let any of that show in her voice during the calls. Her father had taught her that too. Now she watched Earl guide the steam engine down to the edge of the site and bring it to a stop roughly 200 feet from the stuck excavator. He set the brake. The engine idled at a deep, patient frequency, smoke rising, steam breathing from the valves. Then Earl climbed down from the platform with the careful movement of a man whose knees have 50 years of farm work in them and walked to the rear of the machine and began uncoiling a chain. The chain was not what any of them expected. They had expected rope or cable, or perhaps a lightweight chain of the sort you might use to secure a load on a flatbed. What Earl uncoiled was something else entirely. The links were forged steel, each one as thick as a grown man's wrist, the metal worn to a dark patina from decades of use and cleaning and use again. It was heavy enough that Earl handled it in sections, moving along the length of it to lay it out flat behind the engine, and when he had it fully extended, it lay on the ground like something alive, dense and purposeful, and very old. One of the crew members said it quietly and to no one in particular. "That chain has got to weigh 400 pounds. Closer to 5, said the man next to him. Burkhart, the senior engineer, walked over to where Earl was checking the chain's connections. He looked at the links with the professional interest of a man who has worked with rigging equipment most of his adult life. "What's this rated for?" he asked. 80 tons, Earl said. "And it's got some give to it. Steel cable doesn't stretch. When it hits its limit, it fails all at once. Chain stretches a little before it reaches the breaking point. Gives you time to read it back off if you need to." Burkhart looked at the chain for another moment. He didn't say anything, but he moved aside without argument when Earl picked up the working end and started toward the swamp. What happened next was not what anyone would have written into a plan. Earl McCready walked into the swamp, not to the edge of it, into it. He moved with the deliberate testing pace of a man who knows how to read the soft ground, placing each boot carefully, feeling the resistance before committing his weight. The mud came up to his ankles, then his shins. The chain was over his shoulder, and he was pulling the weight of it hand over hand, keeping it off the surface so it wouldn't drag and slow him down. By the time he was 20 feet from the edge, The mud was at his knees, and by the time he was halfway to the excavator, it was at his thighs. The construction site had gone completely quiet. There was no engine noise, no radio, no casual conversation. Every person on that site was watching one 73-year-old man walk through a swamp with 500 pounds of chain on his shoulder, and no one said a word because there was nothing to say that would have added to what was happening. Nora stood at the edge and watched. Her hands were in the pockets of her jacket, and she was very still. Earl was 3/4 of the way to the excavator when it happened. He had just shifted the chain on his shoulder and taken another testing step when the ground beneath his forward foot gave way in a sudden, sharp collapse. Not the gradual yielding of soft mud, but a genuine subsurface failure, an air pocket or a weak channel in the muck, releasing all at once, and Earl dropped. In less than 2 seconds, he was in the swamp past his waist, then past his chest, and the weight of the chain pushed him down and the mud was at his armpits, and he could not get purchase on anything. He did not shout. That was the thing that Garrett Pruitt would remember for the rest of his life. The old man did not shout. He did not panic. He simply stopped moving, which was the right thing to do in soft mud, and he held the chain above the surface and he waited. Garrett was running before he had consciously decided to run. He covered the distance from the bulldozer to the swamp's edge in seconds, and he went into the mud without stopping, and he did not think about his boots or his clothes or the mud that came up past his own knees, and then his own thighs as he pushed toward the old man. He grabbed Earl's forearm with both hands and pulled. The mud held. Mud does not release easily. It is not like water, where you can push through it. Mud grips, and the more surface area, it has the better it grips, and Earl McCready had been in it past his chest. Garrett pulled with everything he had, his own boots sliding, and for a terrible moment, nothing moved. Then 2 other crew members were in the swamp behind him, hands on Earl's arms, and they pulled together, and the mud released with a long, sucking sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unwilling. Earl came out of the swamp covered from chest to boots in black mud. He stood on the firmer ground near the edge, breathing hard for a moment, and then he looked at Garrett. Not with relief, not with surprise, with the level, assessing look of a man deciding something. He handed Garrett the chain. "Hold this a second," he said. He scraped the worst of the mud from his forearms with the side of his hand. He checked the length of chain that was still dry. Then he took it back from Garrett, reset it on his shoulder, and looked at the excavator still sitting 30 feet away in the black muck. "You don't have to," Garrett started. Earl was already walking back into the swamp. There was no discussion after that. No one laughed. No one said anything about the antique or the museum piece. Garrett stood at the edge of the swamp, covered in mud to his thighs, and watched Earl McCready make the rest of the crossing and reach the excavator's frame and begin working the chain's hook into the attachment point on the machine's undercarriage with the careful, unhurried competence of someone who has connected things to other things in difficult conditions for 50 years. It took him 11 minutes to hook the chain properly. He tested the connection 3 times. Then he lifted the rest of the chain from the mud and began making his way back following the same line he had come in on, and this time the ground held. When he reached the solid ground near the steam engine, he connected the chain to the drawbar at the rear of the machine. He checked the connection. He walked the length of the chain between the engine and the excavator, checking for any twist or kink that might cause a failure point. He found one a half turn about 30 feet from the engine, and he worked it out by lifting that section of chain and rotating it by hand, which required lifting something close to 200 pounds off the ground for about 8 seconds. He did this without comment. Then he walked back to the steam engine and climbed up to the platform and stood at the controls. He looked at the pressure gauge. He looked at the water gauge. He put his hand on the throttle. Behind Nora, someone said something she didn't catch. She didn't ask them to repeat it. She was watching Earl's face, and Earl's face was doing something she recognized. It was the face of someone who has arrived at the moment they've been moving toward without hurry, and who finds the moment exactly as they expected it to be. He opened the throttle. The change in the engine was immediate and total. The deep, idling pulse became something else. A purposeful building rhythm, each stroke of the pistons distinct, and committed the flywheel spinning up the gears, engaging with a series of heavy mechanical clicks that you could feel as much as hear. The drive wheels began to turn, slowly at first. Those 6-foot steel wheels with their forged cleats rotating through the first degrees of their arc, each cleat dropping to the ground with a sound like a spike being driven, finding purchase in the graveled surface of the site, gripping. Not spinning, gripping. The chain came off the ground in sections, working its way toward taut, from the engine end outward, each link lifting and straightening and locking into the line as the tension built. It took perhaps 15 seconds for the tension to reach the excavator's end. Then the chain was fully extended and fully taut, and for a moment the whole system, steam engine, chain, excavator, and the 100 feet of mud between them, was in a kind of equilibrium, each element bearing its part of the load. The drive wheels kept turning. Inside the cab of the excavator, something rattled. The whole machine shuddered, once a deep metallic shudder that traveled up through the frame and the boom and the arm and communicated itself to the chain, and from the chain back to the steam engine's drawbar. The pressure gauge on the steam engine climbed. Earl watched it. His hand was on the throttle and his eyes were moving between the gauge and the chain and the excavator, and his expression was concentrated but not worried. He was reading the machine the way you read anything you have spent a long time learning, not thinking about what each piece of information meant, but simply receiving it the way a musician receives the sound of their own instrument. He pushed the throttle a fraction further. The excavator moved. It was not a dramatic movement. It was perhaps 2 inches, maybe 3, and it came accompanied by a sound from the mud that was unlike anything most of the people on that site had ever heard. A deep, reluctant groan from beneath the surface, the sound of suction and compression, and the slow, massive resistance of saturated earth being asked to give up what it had held for 3 days. But it moved. One of the crew members said something. Nobody agreed or disagreed, they just watched. Earl opened the throttle further. The engine's rhythm accelerated, the cleats biting deeper into the ground, the smoke from the stack thickening. The drive wheels did not slip. They did not spin in place or fight the load or back off. They turned steadily and continuously with the remorseless patience of something that has been making this particular effort in various forms for 80 years and knows exactly how to do it. The excavator moved again. Not inches this time. A foot, then another foot. The mud at the edges of the machine's submerged tracks began to show movement, a slow churning, the earth being displaced rather than released, the machine working its way upward and forward at the same time. Nora heard the sound before she understood it. A collective sound from the crew around her. Not words, not a cheer, not the organized noise of a planned response, but the involuntary sound people make when something happens that they had stopped believing was possible. She heard it and understood what it meant, and her eyes went to the excavator, and she saw the tracks. The tracks were emerging, black and dripping, coming up out of the muck an inch at a time, the machine rising as it moved forward, the mud releasing it in sections. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Not to hide anything, she was past hiding anything. She pressed her hand to her mouth because it was there, her hand, and she needed to put it somewhere, and that was where it went. 10 feet, 20 feet. The excavator was moving faster now, the momentum working in its favor, the mud unable to maintain the same grip on a moving object that it had held on a stationary one. The sucking sounds from beneath the surface came faster and faster, and then changed in quality, becoming less like resistance and more like release. And then the rear of the machine came fully clear of the swamp, and the tracks were in the air for a moment, dripping, before they came down on firmer ground and found traction, and the whole 60-ton machine lurched forward under its own weight. Earl pulled it another 100 feet, past the edge of the swamp, past the churned ground where the bulldozers had spun out on day one, out onto the solid gravel of the site's working area, where the ground was packed and level and real. Then he closed the throttle and set the brake and let the engine come back down to its idle. He reached up and pulled the cord on the steam whistle. The sound came out across the site and across the fields and across the flat open country of Crow Wing County, Minnesota, on the morning of September the 17th, 1992. It was not a subtle sound. It was a high-carrying, unapologetic scream of steam through brass, the same sound that had announced the arrival of threshing crews across the upper Midwest for 50 years, the same sound that had echoed across these fields when Silas McCready was a young man and the world ran on steam and muscle and the willingness to do hard work slowly. The crew erupted, not all at once. It started with a few of the men who had been closest to the swamp, who had watched the chain come taut and the tracks emerge, and the machine rise, and then it spread outward as the men further back understood what they were seeing, and within a few seconds, every person on that construction site was making noise of some kind. Garrett Pruitt, still covered in mud to his thighs, put both fists in the air. Caldwell, the youngest engineer, was laughing the way people laugh when relief overflows everything else and comes out looking like joy. Burkhart, the senior engineer, stood with his arms at his sides and looked at the steam engine and said nothing. But his face had changed. Nora did not move from where she was standing. She stood at the edge of the swamp where she had stood for 3 days, and she looked at the excavator sitting on solid ground 150 feet away, mud-caked and dented and absolutely intact, and she felt something move through her that she did not have a ready name for. It was not simply relief, though relief was part of it. It was not simply gratitude, though that was there too. It was something older and less comfortable than either of those things. Something that had to do with the gap between what she had believed and what had turned out to be true. She had laughed at him. Not loudly, not to his face, but in the privacy of her own assessment, she had looked at Earl McCready and his John Deere and his steam engine, and she had assigned them a value, and that value had been approximately 0, and she had been wrong. She had been wrong in the same direction she always complained about being wronged, the direction of underestimation. She turned around. The crew was still celebrating, men shaking hands and pointing at the excavator and telling each other what they had just seen, as though the person they were talking to had not also just seen it. Earl had climbed down from the steam engine's platform and was checking the chain connection at the drawbar, unhooking it methodically, coiling the chain back the way he had found it. He was covered in mud from chest to boots, and he was working with the same unhurried competence he had shown doing everything else that morning. She walked over to him. He looked up when she was a few feet away. He did not say anything. "Mr. McCready," she said. He waited. She had prepared something to say. In the minutes while the excavator was being pulled, in the part of her mind that was always preparing the next thing to say, she had assembled a series of sentences about professionalism and results and the remarkable capabilities of his equipment. She had a line ready about the donation to the Historical Society, about arranging the transfer of funds. She had, in the manner that 8 years of running a company had trained her into, prepared a graceful and appropriate response to the outcome. She did not say any of it. She said, "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." Earl looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to coiling the chain. "You weren't wrong about anything you knew," he said. "You were wrong about what you didn't know." "That's a different problem." She watched him work. "I've been on the other side of that particular mistake more times than I can count," she said. Earl straightened up and looked at her again. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of someone who recognizes something they have seen before. "Most people have," he said. The morning after the rescue, Nora Reeves drove to Earl McCready's farm. She had not planned to go that morning. She had a full day in front of her insurance adjusters to call a damage assessment on the excavator, to supervise a conversation with the MNDOT liaison that she had been avoiding for 24 hours. Her project manager had left 3 messages. Her accountant had left 2. The loan officer at First Midwest Bank had left 1, and his was the most carefully worded, which meant it was the most urgent. She drove to the farm anyway. She found Earl in the barn. He had the steam engine's rear access panel open and was working on something inside it with a long wrench, moving with the methodical patience of a man performing routine maintenance on a machine he has maintained routinely for 30 years. He did not hear her come in over the sound of his own work, and she stood in the barn doorway for a moment watching him. In the morning light, with the mud cleaned off and the brass polished and the black boiler gleaming, the engine looked different than it had on the construction site. On the site, it had been a working thing, defined by what it was doing, evaluated against the task in front of it. Here in the barn, it was something else. It was an object made with enormous care by people who had believed when they made it that they were building something that would last. The proportions of it, the weight and presence of it, the way the light fell across the drive wheels and the boiler and the stack. It was not simply old. It was finished, completed. The way a thing is completed when every part of it has been made to exactly the purpose it serves and nothing has been included that does not belong. Earl heard her boots on the barn floor and looked up. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She stopped a few feet from the machine and looked at it. Close up, you could see the individual cleats on the drive wheels, each one worn in its own particular way, from decades of contact with the ground. You could see the repairs, the replaced fittings, and the sections of pipe that were slightly newer than the metal around them, the careful patchwork of a machine that had been kept alive through attention rather than money. I came to apologize properly, she said. Earl set the wrench down on the engine's running board and looked at her. You apologized yesterday, he said. I said the words. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. I dismissed you before you said anything worth dismissing. I looked at you and I made a decision about what you were and what you could do, and I was wrong. That kind of wrong deserves more than a sentence. Earl picked up a rag from the running board and wiped his hands. He seemed to be considering whether to accept this at face value or examine it further. He appeared to decide on the former. Apology accepted, he said. You want coffee? They sat at the kitchen table in Earl's farmhouse with mugs of coffee that was strong enough to be described as aggressive, and Earl talked about the engine the way he talked about for anything which was without performance or elaboration, moving from one thing to the next, in the order they occurred to him, letting Nora ask questions when she had them. He told her about Silas, about the $3,200 in 1912, which had represented by his grandfather's accounting nearly 4 years of net income from the farm, about the 20 years of harvest seasons when the engine had been the center of a traveling operation that moved from farm to farm across the county, and the men who had worked those seasons, most of whose names were lost, now known only from a single photograph that hung in the hallway of the farmhouse. 15 men standing in a line in front of the engine in a field that was probably this field, though it was impossible to say for certain. He told her about finding it under the canvas in 1984, about the 3 years of restoration, about learning to operate it from men who were old enough to remember when steam was not history but simply Tuesday. How did you know it would work? Nora asked. On a job like that with that much at stake. How did you know? Earl looked at his coffee for a moment. I did know, he said. Not the way you know a fact. I knew the way you know something you've studied for a long time without knowing you were studying it. I've watched that swamp for 50 years. I know what the ground does around it, how deep the muck goes and where there's solid material underneath it. And I know what this engine can do not from reading about it, but from running it. Those two things together told me it was possible. That's the closest thing to knowing I had. He paused. Your equipment is better than mine for almost everything, he said. Faster, more precise, easier to operate, safer. I'm not arguing against any of that, but modern equipment is designed with limits built in. When a machine senses it's approaching the edge of what it can safely do, it protects itself. That's good design. It means you don't destroy a $100,000 machine because an operator pushed it too hard once. He looked at the mug in his hands. But it also means there's a ceiling. And on that particular job, in that particular swamp, what you needed was something that didn't have a ceiling, something that would just keep pulling until the job was done or something broke. My engine doesn't know when to quit. The only judgment in the system is mine. And I knew when to stop, and I knew we weren't going to get there. Nora was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather built a world that worked, she said. Then she stopped, hearing how that sounded. No, Earl said. That's right. That's exactly right. He built something that worked, and he kept it working, and when it stopped being necessary, he didn't destroy it. He put it somewhere safe and waited. He paused. I've thought about that a lot over the years. Whether he knew, whether he suspected that someday someone would need it again. I don't think he did. I think he just couldn't bring himself to scrap something that had been made that well. He looked up at her. The machines that last are the ones somebody loved enough to keep. She drove back to the construction site with the windows down, the September air cold enough to be felt but not cold enough to be unwelcome. She thought about what Earl had said, and she thought about her father, and she thought about the company, which was not an abstraction to her, but a specific thing, a collection of people and equipment and knowledge that had been assembled over 30 years and that she had been carrying forward for 8. She thought about Douglas Reeves, who had started with a single backhoe and a used pickup truck, and who had never in her memory turned down a job because it was too difficult, who had also never in her memory made the same mistake twice. The excavator was already in the equipment yard when she arrived, brought in on a lowboy trailer that morning, and placed in the maintenance bay for assessment. She walked through it with the lead mechanic, a man named Hauser, who had been with Reeves Construction for 11 years, and who delivered mechanical news the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis without cushioning, but without unnecessary alarm. The hydraulic system would need a full flush and inspection. Several seals had failed under pressure. One of the track assemblies had a bent component that would require a replacement part ordered from Caterpillar's regional depot. 2 weeks, Hauser said. Maybe 10 days if the part came in fast. She authorized the repairs. She was in her site office, a converted trailer parked at the edge of the equipment yard, when Garrett Pruitt knocked on the door. She told him to come in. He stood in the doorway with his hard hat in his hands, turning it slightly, a gesture she recognized as the physical expression of something a person is trying to decide how to say. "Sit down, Garrett," she said. He sat. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had come to say. "I knew the ground was wrong," he said, "before I drove the machine in there. I felt it when I was doing the preliminary pass the morning before. The way it gave under the tracks, it wasn't solid the way it should have been." Nora looked at him. "I should have stopped and reported it," he said. "I should have flagged it for the engineers and let them assess it." He was not looking at her. He was looking at his hard hat. "That's the procedure. That's what I know to do. Why didn't you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then we were behind on the grading schedule. You'd been on site twice that week asking about the timeline. There was a lot of pressure to keep moving." She heard that. She let it sit. "When you say there was pressure from me," he said, "from you, the way things were. If I flagged soft ground and it turned out to be nothing, I'd be the guy who called a stop on the whole operation over nothing. If I was wrong about it being a problem, I was going to look like I didn't know what I was doing." He finally looked up, so I made a call. I told myself it was probably fine. I kept moving. Nora looked at him for a long time. She thought about what she had said to Earl that morning, about being wrong in the direction of underestimation, about the gap between what you believe and what turns out to be true. She thought about the 8 years of building a reputation for not tolerating delays, for holding every person in the company to a standard of performance that did not accommodate uncertainty. She thought about how she had built that reputation deliberately as a counterweight to the assumption that she would be soft, that a woman who had inherited rather than built would ease up where her father had held firm. She had never eased up. She had held firm on everything, including timelines, including pressure, including the implicit message that stopping to report uncertainty was a luxury the operation could not afford. She had been trying so hard to be taken seriously that she had built a system where a man felt safer driving into a swamp than telling her the ground was soft. She was quiet long enough that Garrett's expression shifted from apprehensive to something more genuinely uncertain. "I'm not going to fire you," she said. "What happened was a failure of judgment. Yours and mine both. You should have stopped and reported. That's true. But you should also have worked in an environment where stopping and reporting felt like the right call, and that's on me." He looked at her. "I'm sorry I didn't stop," he said. "I'm sorry you felt like you couldn't," she said. He left a few minutes later, and she sat alone in the trailer for a while, not working, just sitting. The sounds of the equipment yard came through the thin walls, the distant sound of the D9 bulldozers on the grading run, the radio in the maintenance bay, the ordinary sounds of a construction site doing what construction sites do when the crisis has passed and the work has resumed. She was still sitting there when she found the letter. It was not a dramatic discovery. She was not searching for anything in particular. She had pulled the Highway 10 project binder from the shelf to check a specification, and the letter was between the binder and a folder of delivery manifests, slightly out of alignment with everything around it, which was the only reason she noticed it at all. It was an envelope standard business size with the Reeves construction address typed on it and a return address she did not immediately recognize. McCready Farm, Rural Route 3, Crow Wing County. She opened it. The letter was 2 pages handwritten in a deliberate, unhurried hand. It was dated June 11th, 1992, 3 months before the accident. It described in plain and specific language the condition of the soil on the eastern edge of the McCready property bordering the Highway 10 right-of-way. It identified the location of an underground spring that fed the swamp and described how the spring's flow created zones of saturated, structurally unstable ground that extended further from the visible swamp than a surface assessment might suggest. It named with reference to landmarks the specific area that was most at risk. The area was exactly where the excavator had gone in. At the bottom of the second page below Earl's signature, there was a stamp and a date. The stamp was the Reeves Construction Receiving Office stamp. The date was June 17, 1992, a Monday. The letter had been received, stamped, filed, and had gone no further. She sat for a very long time. She drove to the farm the following Saturday morning. Earl was in the barn again. The access panel was closed now, and he was doing something to the boiler fittings with a small brush cleaning scale from around a valve seat. He heard her come in and looked up and then looked at what she was carrying, which was the letter in its original envelope held in both hands. He straightened up slowly and looked at her face. He set the brush down. She held out the letter. "I know," he said. She waited. "I sent it in June," he said. "Figured you'd want to know about the ground condition before you started the grading phase." He paused. "When I saw the machine go in, I knew the letter hadn't gotten to anyone who could act on it. But I didn't come over to make that point. I came over because the machine was in the swamp, and pointing at who was at fault wasn't going to get it out." She was still holding the letter. "You could have said something," she said. "When you came to the site, when I was deciding whether to let you try, you could have put that letter on the table and changed the entire conversation." "Yes," Earl said. "Why didn't you?" He picked up the brush again and turned it in his hands. "Because the machine was in the swamp," he said, "and none of the rest of it was going to change that." He looked at her, "And because I've seen what happens when people lead with being right. The person on the other end gets defensive and digs in and learns the wrong lesson. You spend all your energy on the argument about fault and none of it on the thing that actually needs doing." He set the brush down again. "Lessons you find yourself stay with you," he said. "Lessons someone throws in your face, you remember those too. But what you remember is the shame, not the thing you were supposed to learn." He met her eyes. "I didn't want you to remember shame. I wanted you to remember the swamp." She looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at Earl. She thought about what Douglas Reeves would have made of this man, and she thought that her father, who had been a good judge of people, in the way that people who have dealt fairly with others all their lives tend to be good judges, would have recognized something in Earl McCready that was rarer than competence. Would have recognized the particular quality of someone who knows how to give a person the room to become better, without making them feel diminished in the process. She put the letter back in the envelope. "The donation to the Historical Society," she said. "I was going to write a check for $5,000. I'd like to make it 15. Earl shook his head. "10, he said. "I told you what the work was worth. I meant it." "Fine," she said. $10,000, and my personal thanks." She paused. "I won't forget what you did." "Most people forget," Earl said. "Not as a reproach, simply as a fact, the way you state a fact about weather or soil." "I won't," she said. She was almost to the barn door when Earl spoke again. "Miss Reeves," she turned. "Your father would be pleased," Earl said. "Not about the swamp, about what you just did with it." She drove back to Brainerd with the windows up this time. The air had turned properly cold, the kind of cold that means the season has made up its mind. The fields on either side of the county road were pale gold, with cut corn stubble, flat and wide under a low gray sky, the same color and the same light they had been every October of Earl McCready's 50 years on this land. The story moved the way stories move in rural Minnesota, which is to say faster than you would expect, and further than seems reasonable. By the end of October, the Brainerd Dispatch had run a feature. A television crew from the CBS affiliate in St. Cloud came out and spent a day at Earl's farm filming the steam engine, filming Earl answering questions in the patient, abbreviated way. He answered all questions, giving them exactly what they needed and nothing more. The story ran on the 6 o'clock news on a Wednesday, and the phones at Reeves Construction rang for 3 days afterward, people calling to say they had seen it, people calling to ask if it was real. It was real. Over the next 9 years, Earl McCready and the 1912 Case steam traction engine were called on 11 times. 2 excavators, 3 grain combines that had found the same soft patch in a field north of Nisswa, 3 years running a cement mixer that had gone into a drainage ditch in conditions that should have been manageable, but weren't, various pieces of agricultural and construction equipment that had found the edges of what the earth would hold and gone past them. Earl never charged for the work. Every rescue ended with a donation to the Crow Wing County Historical Society, whatever the owner felt was appropriate. The amounts varied. The outcome did not. The Historical Society used the money to build a proper display building on their property in Brainerd, a structure dedicated to the preservation of steam-era agricultural and industrial equipment from the upper Midwest. Earl's case engine was the centerpiece, not permanently. Earl kept the machine at the farm, fired it up once a month, ran it at county fairs and steam shows and school demonstrations right up through the last year of his life. But the museum built a display around its history with photographs and documents and the names of all 11 rescues and a plaque that read exactly what Nora had suggested it should read, because when the Historical Society's board had asked her to draft the language, she had thought about it for a long time and then written, "Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built." Earl McCready died on a September morning in 2001, 9 years almost to the day, from the morning he had driven his John Deere to the edge of a construction site in Crow Wing County. He was 82 years old. His son Clem found him on the porch of the farmhouse with a cup of coffee in his hand and a small and settled expression on his face, the way a person looks when they have arrived at a moment they are entirely at peace with. The steam engine was visible from the porch sitting in the open barn door because Clem had fired it up 2 days earlier for a demonstration at the county fair and had not yet put it away. The funeral was the largest Crow Wing County had seen in a generation. Nora Reeves came. She had driven up from Brainerd the night before and stayed in the same motel in Cross Lake she had stayed in during the Highway 10 project, in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and lake water. She had prepared remarks which she had written and rewritten and finally abandoned in favor of saying what she actually meant, which was this, that Earl McCready had saved her company. Not just the excavator, but the company. Not just the company, but the possibility of the company. The possibility of Reeves Construction continuing to be a thing that existed and employed people and built roads and honored the work her father had begun. And that he had done this while also teaching her something that 8 years of running a company had not taught her, which was the difference between a machine designed to be efficient and a machine designed to be necessary, and what that difference looked like when it mattered. She said that the last part not as a metaphor, though she knew it was one. She said it as a fact because it was also that. She cried in front of 400 people and did not try to stop. Clem McCready took over the farm and the steam engine when his father died. He had grown up learning both the farm and the machine, had sat on the platform of the running engine as a boy, the same way Earl had sat on it as a boy, watching his father's hands on the controls. He maintained the engine with the same monthly firing, the same careful attention to valves and gauges, and the slow accumulation of small repairs that keeps an old machine alive. He took it to the same fairs and steam shows, answered to the same questions from children who had never seen anything like it, gave the same patient explanations. He also got the calls, not as many as his father had received. The years passed and the equipment improved, and the situations that required something outside the capabilities of modern machinery became less common, though they did not disappear entirely. When the calls came, Clem went. The answer was always the same as his father's answer, which was yes, and I'm not charging you, and if it works, you can make a donation to the Historical Society. In the autumn of 2015, 23 years after the original rescue, a Caterpillar excavator went into the same swamp in Crow Wing County. Different machine, same swamp. The equipment had improved considerably in 23 years. The operator was a young man named Tyler Hargrove, 28 years old, who had recently taken over Hargrove Construction from his father, who had taken it over from his grandfather, Ray Hargrove, who had been the largest private contractor in central Minnesota before he sold the company in 2003 and retired to a lake place outside Ely. Ray Hargrove had called Tyler before he handed over the company. He had called him and told him about the Highway 10 project and Nora Reeves and the steam engine, and he had told him specifically about the swamp in Crow Wing County and what the ground around it was like and what the consequences of underestimating it were. Tyler had listened politely. He had 21st century equipment, a full survey team, ground-penetrating radar on the preliminary assessment. He had data that his grandfather had never had access to. He drove the machine in on a Tuesday morning, and it was in the swamp by 10 o'clock. He called Clem McCready from the site. Clem arrived 2 hours later with the steam engine doing 5 miles an hour down the same county road his father had traveled in 1992. He pulled the machine out in 4 minutes, which was 1 minute faster than his father had managed, because the chain was already rigged from a previous job, and the attachment point on the newer excavator was easier to reach. Tyler Hargrove stood at the edge of the swamp and watched the whole thing with the expression of a man who is in the process of having a strongly held belief revised. "Your grandfather warned me about this swamp," he said to Clem afterward while Clem was coiling the chain. "He told me. He said the only thing that had ever gotten equipment out of here was your family's machine." He paused. "I told him that was 1992, that we had better technology now." Clem looked at him without particular judgment. "And how did that work out?" he said. "About like you'd expect. Your grandfather was right." Tyler looked at the steam engine, at the 6-foot drive wheels, in the black boiler, in the brass fittings that caught the October light the same way they had caught the September light in 1992. At the machine that had been built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1912, that had worked the harvest seasons of the teens and 20s and sat under canvas for 50 years and been restored by a patient man with a long wrench and an older man who remembered, and that had been pulling things out of the earth in Crow Wing County, Minnesota for more than 100 years. "My grandfather was right about a lot of things," Tyler said. Clem climbed up to the platform. He checked the pressure gauge. He checked the water gauge. He put his hand on the throttle the way his father had put his hand on the throttle, and his grandfather had put his hand on the throttle, and he thought about all of the mornings that this particular gesture had been made on this particular machine by Silas, and by men whose names were not even known anymore. Men in the photograph in the hallway. He pulled the whistle cord. The sound went out across Crow Wing County, across the pale October fields, and the flat water of the lake to the east, and the birch and ash that bordered the swamp to the northeast. It was the same sound it had always been, steamed through brass, high and carrying and unapologetic. The sound of something that had been built to last, and had lasted, and that would go on lasting because there were people who understood what it was for and were willing to do the work of keeping it alive. The sound faded out across the fields. The fields were quiet. The engine idled on.